everyone's going to get booted off. So yeah, we're going to have to hit the camera button again. Perfect. Fab. Yeah. Thanks, Geoff. All yours. Go for it.
Great. All right. Well, many thanks, Zara and Andrew. Thank you all for being here. I hope you're getting something to eat. I'm going to share some experiences, some thoughts, perhaps some tools which might be useful to you. And I'd encourage you, use the chat function as I'm speaking, either to put questions in or comments or links to things you think other people on the chat, on the session might find useful. The more conversational we can make it, the better. But I'm going to use a few slides just to share some materials, and kicking off with design. A long time ago, worked a little bit with a guy called Herbert Simon, who once won the Nobel Prize for economics, actually, and was one of the great sort of thinkers about why, in a sense, design affects everything. And you can see that quote on the screen. Why, in a sense, the design of physical things or remedies or sales plans or a welfare policy, they're all, in a sense, part of human civilization, the science of design, and this should be a core discipline for every educated person, he argued. This is about 60 years ago. And he also said, all the fields that create designs are concerned with thinking not just about how things are, but how they could be. And to me, the key of this community is that you're constantly thinking not about just what is or analyzing the past and present, but what could be. And I think we need a lot more of that in the future. So my interest with you is really, how does government need to be designed or redesigned in 2025, 2026? My background is partly from working with different bits of government. I worked in city government, in Number 10, the Cabinet Office, in Prime Minister's Office in Australia, the European Commission, probably about 50 countries around the world. But I've also done bottom-up projects, creating organizations, running foundations, Nesta Young Foundation, now at UCL in engineering. And I've written various books on some of these topics, like on social innovation and how to do public strategy, which I hope is an issue will come back next year. And my two most recent ones are one on how to reignite imagination, the one on the left, which came out in paperback a few weeks ago, has a lot about design in it, about how you use different methods to expand imagination, and another one last year on science, which is a little bit to one side. So for me, the kind of key, in a sense, question you all face is summed up by this rather depressing chart from about a year ago, looking at many countries and showing that around the world, the public actually doesn't think governments are either very competent or very ethical and very trustworthy. And to me, the central design question is, how do we get governments to be both trusted, trustworthy, but also good at making stuff happen and competence? And I'm going to go through very quickly quite a few dimensions of what I think are some of the answers to that. And hopefully you can comment, agree, disagree, whatever. And in a sense, for all of us in the UK, we've got this sort of slightly weird state machinery. I sometimes think of it as a series of layers which go back to, in fact, the Anglo-Saxon state was a rather efficient state. The Tudors reinvented it. The colonizing imperial projects of the East India Company, the Fabians, Thatcherism, all these layers accumulated. But I think we're probably in need of another one of these moments of significant reinvention. So what might guide that? So much of my work is really about how do you put intelligence and the design of intelligence at the core of the state. In some ways, this is obvious. Almost everything you do needs data, evidence, tacit knowledge, citizen input, and so on. But we still don't organize that at the heart of government. Business is increasingly organized around intelligence. The public sector isn't. And one of the things I work on is summarized in that little diagram in the top right. How do you orchestrate in any field, whether it's care for the elderly or transport or policing, the combination of data, models, analysis, memory, creativity in loops of action and learning. And in some ways, we're very lucky. We have amazing, informational intelligence tools. That's a map of air quality in London, incredibly granular, detailed knowledge. We have linking data sets like Leo, which links educational data to tax data. Nowhere else in the world does this. It shows all sorts of patterns. We have satellite data from things like Copernicus, real-time pictures of forests and seas, and AI, which I'll talk a bit more about, providing new tools for thinking. But I still think we've got a long way to go in actually redesigning the functions of the state to make the most of all these different kinds of intelligence, and crucially to integrate them together. And one example of that, which I'm working on at the moment, is how do we move beyond the current state of online services, which in some ways are pretty good, things like gov.uk, towards much more active, really companion services like a future NHS app, which is providing not just easy access to your records and appointments, but also short form video content, peer communities, rankings of other kinds of data. Anyway, I'm publishing a thing next week on that, and a similar one on navigating jobs and skills. How does a government help people to decide what skills they might need to have a decent, well-paying job in 5 or 10 years' time? So these are all examples of the design of intelligence to make it useful for citizens, which I think is going to be a great topic of the next few years. A second theme is how to act as a mesh. So I think almost everything government does now is in partnership with others. It may be with local authorities, combined authorities, with business, with civil society. We need new ways of thinking about how the state works, much more about systems, weaving, collaboration. And again, there are lots of examples of this, and I'll say some concrete ones a little bit later. But it needs to be part of almost the basic design mindset, not traditional command and control downwards through pyramids. And this means very different ways of organizing government itself, Whitehall departments. So I've worked both at a European level. I'm doing some work with lots of cities at the moment, all of their options for organizing in more mesh kind of ways with cross-cutting budgets, targets, knowledge management, back office, platform tools, front ends, what we call flash teams for emergencies and so on, as well as lots and lots of different kind of partnerships. There's a whole menu of ways in which you can break free from the silos, but they keep being forgotten in the British government. I'm amazed how little shared knowledge and memory there is of how you organize in these mesh methods. Hopefully this will be obvious to all of you, but it's not actually to many ministers or even permanent secretaries. And there are many examples to learn from around the world, including quite similar ones like New Zealand, which had a whole system of system leads in the last 5 years to do that weaving job across the system to get it to work more like a mesh. The next issue is innovation, which you're all involved in. I still think it's slightly strange. We have such a mismatch between extraordinary innovation in science and technology and business and so little in the public sector. There's $1.5 trillion being spent this year on AI. The UK government is spending, I think it's about nearly 20 billion on R&D, but almost none of that is R&D for public services. I'm a fan of FDR, who in another period of great turmoil in the 1930s when he was US president, really made it core to his mission that there had to be experimentation to try things, realize that some of them would fail, and then try others. I've been working on this stuff for years. I've run lots of labs and teams and funds here and in other countries. And in a few months' time, I've tried to put it all together in a book which comes out next April, really on the practicalities of public sector innovation. How do you organize the structures, the teams, the processes, the finance, the data, and so on? All quite boring, maybe, but potentially useful to some of you. And there are lots of tools out there. At Nesta, we develop with many partners around the world this framework for seeing all the stages of innovation from understanding opportunities and challenges to idea generation, testing, business models, scaling, etc. And on the right, you see some of the creativity tools, the fast idea generators, which are really useful for getting teams of frontline staff or people to come up with ideas. Again, they keep being forgotten, these methods. The wheels are endlessly reinvented. And there's lots out there which can be used. And one other source which I would recommend is the UNDP Accelerator Labs, set up in about 100 countries in this decade. And they've got a whole set of toolkits, some of which I was involved in, many others were too, to try and help teams understand problems, generate ideas, implement them, and so on. So please don't reinvent the wheel. Use these methods. If you've got better ones, great. But this is a field which is rather bad at remembering what it used to know. Next, trust. Many of you will know these kind of charts, which show, if you look, still very high levels of public trust in groups like doctors and scientists and teachers, but unfortunately politicians and civil servants way, way down. And I think we're in an era where trust is central to design. Cross-national surveys show that if people feel they have a say in governments, they're much more likely to trust them. If they don't feel they have any influence or control, they don't tend to trust them. So it should be obvious that finding ways to design the right kinds of input, whether it's at a neighborhood level or in a health service or schooling, should be core to government reform. Is not enough just to do things top down and think you'll be thanked for delivering some result. I mean, people do want things like, less shorter waits in accident and emergency, but that's not enough. So we've got to have a lot of reform of engagement. There are many, many ways of doing this. I'm sure some of you are involved in this, but I think the key point I'd make is this isn't an optional add-on. It is actually core. I'm sure AI dominates much of your life. I teach a course at UCL on AI in public services. We try and make it as boring as possible by going into the detail of AI in tax, in welfare, and so on, in chatbots, because AI is still, I think ministers often don't really understand it, so they talk about it as something magical, you can spray on everything. We've got to get much more fine-grained in understanding all the different ways AI can be used, and this diagram just summarizes the many very different uses of AI for everything from service interfaces to democracy to policy design, etc. I think some of the missing bits are systematic experiment around AI and fast learning. As far as I know, the UK still doesn't have even a basic sharing of evaluation and evidence on AI effectiveness and evaluations. Europe doesn't either, or the US. And it seems to me very strange that so much money is going to AI and without any use of the basic intelligence orchestration tools which can help us avoid future errors and scandals. And in practice, in almost every real public service, it's combinations of AI and collective intelligence which are key. Again, to me, this is a key part of design in the late 2020s. This is just one example I happened to be teaching about last week, which is Denmark's use of AI for risk modeling child maltreatment detection. And I've just put it up here because you can see the extraordinary range of kinds of data they have combined. Nowhere in Britain can do this yet. It's very, risky perhaps in terms of some of the privacy concerns, but you can only really flush out the options through experiments, through trials, through finding what works and what doesn't. Next, money. I don't know how many of you work on finance issues. I've become more and more convinced that the basic methods of public finance are misaligned with what governments say they want to achieve. And an obvious example of that is that most public spending now is on humans, and yet we still do spending on health and education and care annually, Whereas we have very sophisticated investment methods for understanding spending on bridges or roads or airports, which are amortized over 30 or 40 years. And yet humans last longer than infrastructures now. So that's just one example of many where we haven't updated the design of public finance to fit our contemporary era. There are many sort of pointers to the future: multipliers, well-being budgets, whole of government accounts, impact bonds, many of them trying to use data to make it much clearer what money is being used for and what it's achieving. These are just a few of the examples of different kinds of balance sheet and impact tracking. The Treasury is not quite bought into this yet, but at some point this is going to become, I think, a key field of design: how to use all of your methods to really ensure the ways money is organized better align with the stated purposes of government. The next one I want to mention is really complexity reduction. I've been a bureaucrat much of my life, and I kind of partly love bureaucracy, and bureaucracy solves many of the world's problems, but all bureaucracies tend to become too complex, too many layers of decision making or regulation or surveys. And I'm in a university; they're pretty much the worst institutions for this, and so the burdens on the public become ever greater. So I'm a great believer in regularly, ruthlessly culling unnecessary process, unnecessary bureaucracy. I've worked a lot in Australia, which has always had a principle of looking at the cognitive load on citizens and trying to keep that as low as possible. British government often does the opposite, makes it as high as possible, and that's no good in this era. So a key sort of design challenge is simplicity. How do you get ruthlessly radical simplicity to make systems work easier, but also to make life easier for citizens? And this relates to cost reduction. So Doge apparently last week stopped existing. Elon Musk's chainsaw, a bit of a disaster. But I actually think the questions Doge was asking, which essentially is how to get greater efficiency, are good ones. And a few months ago, I published a set of proposals on Doge done better. How should you do an efficiency program in a government? Essentially, this is using lots of design methods, design thinking, but for efficiency. This is being taken up in actually quite a few countries, not quite the UK yet. But given the pressures on public finance, we can't avoid the questions raised by Musk and co, even if we don't like the way they did it. The next thing I want to raise, which Zara mentioned, is institutions. I've become a little bit obsessed with the conservatism, small c, of public institutions, that they all literally look pretty much like they did 50 or 100 years ago. And I've been working with a group around the world on what should next generation public institutions look like. What are the future equivalents of the BBC, the NHS, the OU, all these other institutions many of us interact with day to day. And it's called the Institutional Architecture Lab. And essentially it's a design exercise for the new institutions we may need to regulate AI or data, or for mental health, or for climate transitions, or for organizing transport in a city. And I'll just give you a flavor of some of the ways of thinking, which are rather different from what you'll hear, I suspect, in Whitehall. So we've been looking a lot at stack-based institutions, drawing on often digital models of where you can organize different levels of a stack differently. And this is relevant for everything from urban regeneration to regulation. We're looking at protocol-based institutions. This is the basic idea of the internet, where you don't try and design a big agency to run everything, but you design, again, very simple rules of interconnection. And through that, you can reshape feels like energy. Again, it's a quite different mindset. It should be normal given we've had the internet for 50 years, but it's still not understood in most bureaucracies. We draw a lot on biological metaphors. How do you create institutions much more like myceliums or swarms or corals, where they are organically sharing knowledge or resources, where the above ground is different from the below ground. And the Buurtzorg social care organization in the Netherlands is one example of this mycelium type thinking. And there's a whole load of examples we've published. This is one in my mind. We're redoing it this week, which is a new kind of institution to protect elections from attack with deep fakes and subversion, a very live topic for obvious reasons across Europe, as Russia is apparently about to spend €2 billion to influence the next French election and get a party favourable to them, the far right, into power. It saddens me that democracies have been so slow to respond to the new threats. And this is one example of a kind of institution which could protect us. And we've done other ones for everything from procurement to future generations to climate tipping points. For this audience, I also want to mention something a little bit marginal, but maybe of interest to you, is I've become very interested in what the physical spaces could or should be like, or indeed the virtual spaces for designing policy. Most governments still sit around tables in rooms which look pretty much like they did, again, 50 or 100 years ago. So the design question is, what kind of spaces would allow better decision making? And this is just one example which we published and is being done by quite a few governments, where you create what we call policy steering rooms. It's a very simple idea. You use the four walls to capture the different dimensions of issues. Let's say you're working, I don't know, could be stopping the boats or street crime, or maybe it's Sen in schools. On one wall, you put the facts. What's the data? What are the patterns you need to understand to make a good decision? On another wall, you put the evidence. What do we actually know? What's been proven or disproven? A third wall is for the innovations. What are the promising ideas, not yet proven, but which could be relevant? And then on the fourth wall, you put the possible, where are we trying to get to in 10, 20 or 30 years' time? And the team working on policy literally populate these walls with diagrams and bits of paper and images and so on. And then the ministers, when they're making a decision, they actually come into the room, they walk around, discuss what are the relevant patterns, proven evidence, innovations and systems change directions before they make a decision. Now, there are lots of other examples. There's a proliferation of different kind of decision room and theatres and so on around the world. But I think this is quite a fertile space for using design imagination to help liberate bureaucracies from the sort of the square room with blank walls or the occasional PowerPoint. Anyway, your ideas on that would be very welcome. I've done a lot on sort of skills and mindsets. A year or two ago, published some proposals on what a new national school of government could look like. I've been working in China and the US on their next generation skills, and I've just summarized there some of the differences, I think, between the 20th century government skill set and the 21st century skill set. And on the left, some of the work we did, again, with a group of governments around the world on innovation skills in particular. And that really reinforced that it's the mindset as well as the skill which is key, and ways where you try things and learn by doing rather than just traditional pedagogy. My hope is in the next year or so, we will see a real overhaul of the skills and training support for civil servants, and ideally actually for ministers as well, so they are better at making decisions. They understand AI and data and science and public psychology, all the things which are so obviously vital to governing now. And perhaps the very last bit in that table, a much more global perspective. I learn more these days from Asia and Africa and Latin America than from the traditional places we look to, which was the US or France. And I think it's very important to have a global perspective on the cases, the methods, the ideas needed for government. And the final one is really about sort of ethos. Um, and I've become increasingly interested, almost the aesthetic of government and public services in the near future. And there are two prompts which I've found useful for this. And again, any views, disagreements, welcome. One is from architecture, which has increasingly looked at models of building buildings which achieve strength without weight. This is a cathedral made out of cardboard by Shigeru Ban, a Japanese architect. And lots of architecturists try to pull out the big columns, the structures, all the heavy stuff you used to need for a building, and you don't anymore. And another example of this is in materials science, where graphene, one of the UK's sort of great innovations of recent years, is a material which achieves incredible strength with very little weight. And so I argue we need to actually use strength without weight as a design ethos for policies, for regulations, for laws, for institutions. That almost should be our vision of the next generation of government. It's not heavy process, bureaucracy, regulation, paper, laws. Is achieving maximum impact for minimum weight. So again, I'd be interested in your views on this. If you're interested, as I say, I've published lots of stuff on this. I have a view that we need to think of a repertoire of methods. And one of the problems in government, you tend to get fashions for particular things, very command and control bureaucracy, new public management, privatization, or more recently, things like missions, or this year, abundance. And these are usually relevant to maybe 5, even 10% of what government does, but they're always overgeneralized, and then they go wrong and everyone's disappointed. So I think part of your task as policy designers is very much like running a hospital. And I've just put up a little diagram of a hospital signboard there. Hospital has lots of different methods for dealing with lots of different things, from orthopedic to pediatric to antenatal. And government's the same. It needs a diverse repertoire for diverse tasks. And being slaves of fashion often means people forget this really rather obvious point. So a couple of things on design, if you're interested. So, I mean, nearly 10 years ago, I tried to take stock then of what had or hadn't worked in use of design methods in governments around the world. And we used to do these big gatherings of labs, hundreds of labs from around the world. And again, there's another piece written then, and a whole load of other reports and stuff which may or may not be of interest. But I will stop there. And I see there are a few things in the chat, but any disagreements, challenges, questions? And I see from Alexander, well, maybe I might start on this one on the NHS app, because I've just been looking at this again. I actually rather like the NHS app, and I think it's very good. But my suggestion would be for the next stages of evolution to think about what could be linked into the NHS app, and to turn it, in a way, it's what you're saying there, to be much more a companion, a coach, a guide. About a decade ago, we worked with the NHS and the BBC on one version of that, where you would have, alongside the app, providing you with your records, your appointments, your handling of the day-to-day interaction with GPs and hospitals. You'd also have pools of short-form video giving guidance on handling diabetes or fitness or whatever. You would also, within that space, have the peer support networks for particular diseases. You might have a ranking for other sources of health advice. We suggested ranking them with the star rating, 5-star for the really evidence-based, 1-star for the non-evidence-based at all, and moving more and more to a much more interactive relationship with citizens, where there'd be prompts, where you would be getting a suggestion. Have you thought about maybe getting a test for this, or have you thought about this fitness or diet thing? And all cognitively tailored to the very different needs of different people. Now, that didn't happen in several previous goes, but we now have far more agentic AI tools. We've got Microsoft Copilot. We've got lots of things out there doing variants of that. And to my mind, that's where government should be going for health, but also, as I said, for things like education. We have a lifelong learning entitlement coming in 2027, and all sorts of other things. So that's a very quick response to your question, Alex. So, how can design and policy proactively address and mitigate the digital divide? Yeah, so that is, I mean, that's a question which has obviously been around since the birth of the internet, and the multiple digital transformations which have been again underway for 3 decades. I at one point oversaw the e-government program for UK government. That was when so long ago when e-government was the language being used. Then the digital divide was a really big issue because most old people were completely unfamiliar with the internet. I think it's become a rather different issue because internet use amongst the over 70s and over 80s is actually very high now, and many are pretty familiar with how to use things. But often you do need to think about, as you say, the non-digital access routes, either through a friend or a family member or perhaps a social worker, and others. But I don't really see it quite the same. I think the issue has changed greatly. And I was really sort of an epiphany moment for me came about 15 years ago doing a big study on social needs. And I did lots of long interviews with old people, young people, refugees, and others. And even then, many teenagers and refugees were willing to go without food for a day or two just to keep their mobile phone. Digital access was more important than material goods. And I think in our era, as I say, the digital divide is very different in nature, but it's one to always ask about who might be being excluded from anything. Okay. It'd be nice if somebody just talked as well as in text. The burden of bureaucracy around medicine, reducing adverse events. Oh, yeah, that's a very well. I would like to hear Simon Gibbons. What is your answer to your own question? You've probably got a much better answer than me. Do you want to perhaps put your camera on and say something about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. I actually, I'm talking from having worked in a big medical center in the US and observed how they have very low rates of adverse events, but it was a very bureaucratic environment and there was a lot of oversight. But perhaps what was effective or seemed to be most effective was that there was maybe less of a culture of blame on the no one was necessarily responsible, but a procedure was responsible. Now, really, part of it is pushing back on the idea that one can fully take away bureaucracy in medicine because you don't want adverse events, and just putting that up for discussion. It is quite a complex concept, really.
No, I totally agree. I'm not anti-bureaucracy. I actually think bureaucracy is probably the cause of most of human progress. I'd be quite extreme on that. Literally, why we have much lower infant mortality, much lower public violence, higher growth. All of these come from efficient bureaucracy. They don't come just from science or from the market. They come from bureaucracy. But that's why it's so important to get it right. And I think this question of how you deal with error and problems is a really important one, slightly different in different fields. There's a lot of evidence that good high numbers of complaints is often a good thing for a public service, so long as you use them as information. There's an intriguing comment I heard someone make recently that the UK government has moved towards error and trial instead of trial and error. That's to say things go wrong, especially in hospitals, and then you have a 5-year inquiry to blame someone for it. Whereas much better to have something of a no-fault culture where you do make errors, you try things out, but you learn very quickly and you change the protocols to stop future errors. Our public inquiry model, I think, is completely anachronistic and inefficient and counter to a healthy innovation culture. Maybe that's a question for all of you to think about. And it will be different in schools and hospitals and transport and policing, what the appetite is for risk and for error. But the crucial question is, what's the learning system which uses those? And if there is an adverse event, makes it useful. Maybe Alexandra, you're offering to speak as well.
Can I just butt in and just partly to say that I completely agree, and I think that there's a situation here where unless recommendations result in change in policy, then you can identify all the areas in the world, but they have to produce change. So
I mean, one of the many flaws in the design of the public inquiry model, which we spend enormous amounts of money on, is it doesn't have an implementation element. They stop the inquiry with a lot of recommendations, then it folds up. I mean, it could not be more inefficient as a way of solving problems. And I've written quite a lot about this, but it depresses me. We always revert to getting a judge to sit for a few years, to write a report, and then it's sort of hoped that implementation might happen, but there's no follow-up end-to-end process for ensuring it does. Alex, are you going to say something? Yeah.
Yes, I just had a question. Thank you so much. Around design by incorporation of what we already have, both in terms of physical resources, human thinking processes, because it's such a complex system to unravel it all and put it back together, and in terms of not wasting and making use of what we have, still keep some of the initial parts but reorganize them. So how do we start such monumental processes?
Well, it depends what you mean, but I mean, one of the reasons I quite like digital, and my PhD was in digital tech, so I'm sort of immersed in that, is that when you rethink a service through a digital lens, you do often go back to first principles and think, what is actually happening here? What's essential? What's inessential? And many of the answers are radically simpler than what they replace. I mean, maybe let me give you one other example, which again, I've just been looking back at. The UK government has multiple ways that people interact financially with it. To pay taxes, to get benefits, to get student loans, to pay fines, to pay for a passport, dozens and dozens. 20 years ago, we proposed creating a single personal account, a single, in a sense, gateway for all financial transactions, on the grounds that would radically simplify things, cut costs, duplication, be much easier for citizens. Many countries have done something a bit like that. Singapore has, Denmark has. We still haven't got that in the UK because each individual department had, reasonable grounds why they needed to stick with their own, legacy systems and processes. But that's where a sort of serious design process can incorporate some of what already exists, to use your question. But if it really looks at what's possible, looks at the possible, not the existing, can often cut enormous amounts of duplication and waste and human effort and citizen time and so on. And actually the single personal account idea is one I think is worth returning to now for government, because again, the tools are even easier than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And we've got gov.uk, which does a pretty good job on some interactions and transactions. But I feel we just need a bit more ambition and a bit more energy to cut out, say, wasted duplication and process, and above all, wasted time. Okay, Alexander, shout out a question.
Thank you so much. And yeah, be really interested from the first question to see that point on the NHS. And I think some of what we're planning is uncannily similar to what you're talking about. So great to hear it. My question was more general on the weight versus strength metaphor and designing for strength rather than weight. And if you had any thoughts or practical suggestions on how we as an audience, I'm assuming of mostly civil servants or people who work in the public sector, can work towards that, given we are inevitably part of that weight as well. So how do we kind of rage against the system while being the system? How does that actually look? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so I'll put in the chat, I wrote a sort of quite a long blog trying to basically answer that question. Actually, I can't find it now. But if you search Mulgan Strength Without Weight, you'll find a piece which also looked at quite a lot of the processes in various governments around the world, from Korea to Portugal, where they tried to cut unnecessary bureaucracy in a really systematic way, often with quite open processes, getting people to propose ideas and sift them and test them out and so on. So it wasn't all top down. It was often a mix of top down, bottom up, middle out, but all shaped by this ethos. And one of the reasons I think it's so important is about power. So you're all very powerful. You probably don't think you're powerful, but you are objectively. And one of the weird things I've noticed in British government amongst ministers and civil servants is they've lost any sense of their power. And they're all they can see is the constraints, the reasons they can't do anything, why it's so difficult. And yet I think citizens want government to fix stuff. They want it to act. They want it to use its power. And if you become too fixated on, I don't know, the legal constraints or the ECHR or why there's no money, then you're actually really betraying the public who have given you authority and power. So I think part of your job as civil servants, sometimes it's to say to ministers, yeah, you can't do that, that's a stupid idea, but it's actually often to say, well, actually, you can do this, you can fix this. There might be a 5%, 10% risk of a legal challenge or something, but be honest about the risks of using power rather than leaping to this almost learned helplessness, which I just see all across government at the moment. And I'm not a fan of Donald Trump at all, who I think is an evil disaster. But the one thing he does is he uses power. He's not ashamed to use power and to find ways around barriers. We just need a little bit of that spirit, I think, for fixing housing or health or all the things all of you work on. And to me, the strength without weight ethos is it's strength as well as without weight. It is, using the power of the state, of bureaucracy, of money and data to fix things and make people's lives better, not to have lots of excuses why it's so difficult. Okay, Ian, would you like to say something about silos, bureaucracy, hierarchy, whatever? Or Tatura, I can see you've got your camera on, so why don't you come in?
Certainly, thank you. And just off the back of the same point as you just mentioned there, particularly in making legislation, obviously it's not ministers or civil servants who make legislation, it's Parliament. And once it's written, once it's drafted, and we can spend months, even years, crafting the legislation, once it gets into Parliament, it's out of our control. So going back to what you said about teaching civil servants, teaching policymakers, and teaching ministers how to make laws with power without the weight, how would we do the same to Parliament? Because it's the parliamentarians, it's their scrutiny that will ultimately define the shape, the agility, and the usefulness of what finally comes out. Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the peculiarities of the British governance system is Parliament is all powerful. There's very few countries in the world where power is so concentrated in one entity, or rather it's an executive with a majority, can do pretty much what it likes. There's some constraint from a House of Lords and a Supreme Court. I suspect the ways in which Parliament drafts laws will need to change in the future to get better that balance of the very prescriptive and precise and the more interpretable and adaptable. We're getting this in regulation, where one of the shifts in regulatory method to what I call anticipatory regulation says don't try and specify everything in the rules. Recognize you'll have to adapt in response to unpredictable change. The accountability then comes in terms of what you're achieving overall, rather than whether you followed the letter of the law or the letter of regulation. But that's probably quite a big task in the sense to get Parliament to think late 2020s thinking rather than 1970s thinking. And maybe I could just give two other examples of strength without weight, which all of you could act on. I've often in roles where I've run organizations tried to do two or three things. One is to dramatically cut the length of contracts. And I'd always ask our legal team to cut them by 90%. And if we had problems then, okay, we'd add clauses back in. It was always possible to dramatically cut the overhead of contracts and the legal aspects of things. The lawyers will always come up with good reasons why you need lots and lots of clauses. And it's completely out of control in some fields. I have to sign 20-page contracts for a talk. Luckily, not for this one, sometimes. But you're in control of that. And the other is meetings. I actually teach courses on meeting science and meeting design, which can often actually allow meetings to be much, much shorter, but also much more productive. And I wish this was widely understood in Parliament and in the civil service, that there's actually a big body of science of meeting design now, which is almost wholly ignored in those places. It's also ignored in universities, bizarrely, which are not aware of this meeting science. But again, the aim is to increase effectiveness, effective intelligence, decision-making and action, but reduce the overhead of paper, of time, which weighs down on people. So I'd urge you maybe cut every contract by 80 or 90%, cut every meeting by at least 50%, and then see what happens. Okay, is any
Ian.
Ian, yeah.
Thank you. It's a fascinating talk and really wonderful and enlightening to hear. I'm in the Ministry of Defence. In the Ministry of Defence recently, some things have gone wrong in the past, and it's been clear that when those things went wrong, you try and say, well, who was at fault? What happened? And you find a tale of people having to consult 13 other people and nobody knows who did what, and it's got a long history. And if you go back 2 years, it's a different bunch of players. So to try and stop these things happening again, what's happened is, if you like, we've gone back to the old hierarchy model with very clear lines of who's responsible for what, and trying to cut through some of the horizontal links just so that the line of accountability is clear. In other words, we've reverted to using accountability through a classical hierarchy as the primary way of enforcing good governance and making sure things are going on track. Everybody knows that you've got to share information, you've got to have a matrix, but how do you actually make it work in practice so that you can still have the good governance, the accountability, etc.? Because ultimately we're accountable to Parliament. If something goes wrong, the Minister or Secretary of State's got to say something. So how do you get that back into the organisation while also managing the matrix stuff?
Yeah, well, matrix management is always difficult, but kind of essential for any complex organisation. So just one example, which is only a partial answer to you. I've long been obsessed with the question of how any system learns and has a memory of, and in a way, all the things you're talking about are making sense of what was done, what worked, what was a failure, why, and what to do differently. And years ago, I actually designed a comprehensive knowledge management system for Whitehall, which was mainly inspired by the US Army. And I went and spent quite a bit of time with the US Army, which had a very simple method then. I don't know if they still do it, which was every time there was an operation or a policy or a war, they would do a lessons learned exercise. All the people would have to, discuss what had worked, what hadn't, and document it in an easily searchable format with the names of the people involved. So if you came along 5 years later, 10 years later to do something similar, you could really easily find not just, as it were, the formal account, but also somebody you could call up and say what actually happened, what did it feel like, and so on. Now that seemed to me the most basic, minimal thing you need in any Whitehall department and across Whitehall or in any organisation to ensure the collective memory is well organised. If you have that in place, you will still need some hierarchical accountability. You will sometimes need somebody to blame. But things like that, which create a horizontally orchestrated lesson learning ecosystem, if you like, mean you can rely much less on top-down inquiries, defensive, cover your ass behaviours, all the things we know about, which are in an extreme in the current COVID inquiry, where supposedly British government has spent hundreds of millions on responding to an inquiry it set up. which tells you something's gone a little bit wildly wrong in, the difficult patterns of learning. And Parliament, should be integrated into those learning processes, and the PAC and others, slightly more in real time. That would be my other recommendation. So you don't do everything 2 years later or 5 years later, looking back at a sort of formal evidence. But that's only a partial answer to your question. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
And
Second
maybe
one.
we
Yeah.
got time for one more. Yeah.
One last one. Go for it, John.
Sorry, just had to get my camera on. Sorry, I missed the beginning of the presentation, so you may have covered this, but to what extent do you see local devolution, greater devolution in local areas, as being a potential answer to increasing efficiency and effectiveness of policymaking?
Well, I started my career as a local government official, so I've got a strong bias in favour of localisation. I think we've got an over-centralised system in all sorts of ways, but our local government's been so hollowed out in the last 10 or 20 years in terms of capacity. It can't suddenly take on new roles. And this is why I'm recommending a whole series, well, like this again, mesh structures, where groups of local authorities or combined metropolitan authorities share some capabilities around planning or housing or economic growth, working alongside MHCLG and national government. Alongside, hopefully, a steady devolution of powers and tax raising powers to local government. I don't think it'd be that hard to do it, and I've talked to many of the mayors about this, but there seems to be a blockage somewhere in the system. So we still default back to hyper-centralization as a way to get stuff done, despite years of experience that works occasionally for a few things, but most of the time is remarkably inefficient. That would be my summary view. It's quite a big question, though.
I think that's all we have time for. So yeah, thank you everyone for your great questions, and a huge thanks to Geoff for joining us today.
Thank you. Good luck making whatever you do happen. And redesigning the British state. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thanks all.